It was an ordinary day in the bustling city, and Maya, an elegant woman in her early 30s, found herself standing in the waiting room of St. Gregory's Hospital. She rubbed her swollen belly nervously, feeling the familiar weight of her pregnancy pressing down on her. It had been a long few months. Despite her privileged lifestyle, which came with the comfort of wealth and influence, pregnancy had proven to be anything but easy. She wasn't accustomed to being in a hospital like this one, and the sterile environment left her uneasy. But there was no choice today. She'd been feeling an intense pain for hours, and her husband, Richard, had insisted that she come in. Maya was married to one of the most influential men in the city, Richard Donnelly, who was the owner of St. Gregory's Hospital, along with a multitude of other businesses across the region. To the outside world, he was a businessman of untold wealth, a man who kept his affairs in the shadows, rarely seen at public events. They lived a life of luxury in a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, where no detail was too small for perfection. Maya had grown accustomed to this world, but it hadn't come without its own challenges. The pressure of maintaining a perfect image, managing the staff in their home, and dealing with the demands of running a family had drained her, and now, the pregnancy was adding even more strain. She had kept most of her problems to herself, opting not to share them with anyone, even her husband, who was often away on business trips. As she sat in the cold plastic chair, Maya watched as people came and went in the emergency room, their lives unfolding in real time while she sat frozen in her own anxiety. She wasn't a fan of hospitals, she preferred to keep her world private, but today, the pain had become unbearable. The contractions were growing stronger by the hour. She clutched her stomach, hoping for some relief. It was then that Sarah entered the waiting room. Sarah, the nurse on duty, was young but experienced, a hard-working woman with a no-nonsense attitude. She had been working at St. Gregory's for years, but her job had begun to weigh heavily on her. The long hours, the lack of appreciation, and the constant pressure to meet expectations were taking their toll. She had grown bitter over time, frustrated with the system that made her feel invisible, despite the lives she touched every day. When she saw Maya sitting alone, Sarah's initial reaction was one of annoyance. She was used to patients coming in, often from wealthier families, who expected special treatment. Maya, sitting in a designer dress, her expensive shoes slightly scuffed from the rain, looked like one of them. Another rich woman who thought she could waltz in and demand attention. Sarah didn't know it, but this moment would shape both of their futures in ways neither could have predicted. "Ma'am, I need you to fill out some paperwork before we proceed," Sarah said curtly, approaching Maya. She wasn't rude, but there was a dismissive tone in her voice that suggested she was already mentally preparing for another day of patients who were more entitled than grateful. Maya looked up, trying to meet Sarah's eyes but feeling a wave of discomfort at the nurse's impersonal demeanor. She nodded slowly, taking the clipboard from Sarah's hand. "I'm sorry, I think I might be in labor," Maya said, her voice shaky as she leaned back in her chair. Sarah glanced at Maya, clearly unconcerned. "Well, we'll get to you when we can. You can fill out the forms first. The doctors are busy, and you'll need to go through the routine anyway." Maya's heart sank. She had hoped for a bit more understanding, but Sarah's cold response felt like a slap in the face. She had read about St. Gregory's reputation. It was supposed to be one of the best hospitals in the area, but it was clear that wealth didn't always guarantee good treatment. She took the pen and began filling out the paperwork slowly, trying to ignore the growing pain. Meanwhile, Sarah walked away to check on other patients. She had been working long shifts and had seen her fair share of difficult patients who demanded more than they needed. As she made her rounds, she took note of the people around her, sick, injured, and struggling, all while she felt emotionally drained herself. She didn't have time to deal with anyone's drama today, especially not someone who probably didn't even realize what they were asking of her. The hospital buzzed with activity, but for Maya, time seemed to stand still. The pain in her abdomen increased, and soon, she found herself struggling to breathe. She placed a hand over her belly and clenched her teeth, trying not to draw attention to herself. She knew this wasn't normal. Her body was betraying her, and she needed help. But all she was met with was the cold indifference of the staff. After what felt like an eternity, Maya finally managed to fill out the forms and handed them back to Sarah. She was sweating now, her vision blurred, but Sarah merely nodded, offering no sympathy. "Okay, just take a seat. The doctor will see you shortly," Sarah said, turning away without another word. She didn't notice Maya's discomfort, her pale face, or the way her body trembled with each contraction. Maya felt herself growing weaker with every passing moment, and frustration welled up inside her. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She was the wife of Richard Donnelly, a man who owned this entire hospital, and yet here she was, treated like just another patient in line. Her heart raced, not just from the pain but from the growing realization that no one in this place cared who she was. As Sarah continued with her tasks, Maya struggled to stay calm, but it was clear she wouldn't be able to endure much longer. The contractions were coming faster now, and she felt a wave of panic flood her chest. She wanted to scream out, to demand someone pay attention, but she felt as though the hospital itself was a maze of cold walls that kept her from reaching anyone who could help. The minutes dragged on, and it was only when Sarah finally came back to check on her that she took Maya's condition more seriously. By then, Maya had started to sweat profusely, her face contorted in pain, and that's when Sarah noticed, something in Maya's demeanor had shifted. This wasn't just any woman in labor, this was someone who was suffering. The realization struck Sarah, but it was already too late for her to make amends. Maya, looking at her through eyes filled with both anger and fear, said, "You have no idea who I am, do you?" And in that moment, everything would change. The reality of what was happening settled in as Sarah saw the change in Maya. Her composure, which had been so calm and composed just moments earlier, was now shattered. Sweat beaded on Maya's forehead, her breathing labored, and her once pristine appearance now marred by the strain of the labor pains that were growing worse by the minute. Sarah froze. The woman sitting in front of her wasn't just any patient. Maya's eyes, filled with exhaustion and frustration, bore into her, as if expecting some kind of recognition, some kind of respect. But Sarah, still blinded by her own assumptions and exhaustion, hadn't connected the dots yet. Maya's voice trembled, but she was firm, despite the pain coursing through her body. "You really don't know, do you?" she repeated, almost as if Sarah had done something unforgivable. Sarah's mind raced as she looked into Maya's face, trying to understand what she meant. The words barely made sense, but something inside her clicked, a spark of realization beginning to form. The nurse didn't know it, but Maya was no ordinary patient. She had walked into this hospital, discreet and quietly, because that's the life she chose. Her husband, Richard Donnelly, wasn't just another wealthy businessman with influence. He owned St. Gregory's Hospital. He owned everything, from the buildings to the staff's paychecks, and yet, Maya never flaunted it. She wasn't the type to boast about her power or her wealth. In fact, she often went out of her way to keep things quiet, not wanting to draw attention to her husband's name or his business dealings. But today, with every labor pain that struck her body, Maya could feel the power dynamics shifting around her, and she realized she was no longer able to stay silent. She had endured so much, being ignored, dismissed, and disrespected, but this was different. This was not just a matter of discomfort, this was about her health, her baby's life, and, as it turned out, her identity. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her mind finally catching up with Maya's words. "Wait," she whispered, her voice shaky as it slowly dawned on her. "You mean, you're Mrs. Donnelly?" Maya, still in agony, nodded slightly but didn't speak another word. The silence between them grew heavy, but Sarah couldn't pull herself together fast enough to fix the situation. Her mouth went dry. How could she have been so blind? She had treated Maya like any other patient, dismissive, impersonal, and cold. A rush of guilt surged through Sarah as the reality of her actions hit her all at once. But there was no time for regret now. Maya's pain was real, and Sarah had to act. The situation wasn't just awkward anymore, it was urgent. She rushed over to Maya, who had now curled into herself, gripping the edge of the chair, her face pale with the intensity of the contractions. "Mrs. Donnelly, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. Please, just hold on. We'll get you help right away," Sarah stammered, her hands shaking as she tried to help Maya get to her feet. But Maya didn't move. She stared at Sarah, her eyes full of emotion, anger mingling with fear. "No," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "It's too late for that now." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. She could feel her body rejecting everything around her, her husband's name, her wealth, and the coldness of the hospital that she had trusted would protect her. Instead, she had been just another person in the system, overlooked and dismissed. The room suddenly seemed smaller. Maya's breathing grew more erratic, and her vision blurred as the pain intensified. Sarah, panic rising in her chest, knew she had to act fast. She ran to the nurse's station, her mind racing, hoping she could get someone, anyone, to respond to this emergency with the urgency it needed. But as she reached the counter, her eyes fell upon a nameplate, Richard Donnelly. The realization hit her hard. This was his wife. The owner of the hospital. The woman whose health she had ignored, whose pain she had underestimated, was the one person she should have shown the utmost respect for. Sarah's stomach dropped, and she rushed back to Maya, guilt consuming her as she helped the pregnant woman into a more comfortable position. "Please, don't blame me. I made a mistake. I'm trying to help you now." Maya looked up at her, her gaze icy. "It's not about you, Sarah. It's about how you treat people. You have no idea who's walking through these doors, and you should never treat someone like they're invisible. You didn't even ask what I needed. You assumed." The words stung, each one a reminder of her own negligence, of the barriers she had built between herself and her patients. Maya was right. In Sarah's eyes, Maya had been just another woman coming into the ER. But in reality, she was far from ordinary. And now, it was too late to undo what had been done. "Don't say that, Maya," Richard replied, his voice cracking slightly. "You know I had meetings, business. I couldn't just drop everything." The words sounded rehearsed, even to him. They felt hollow, like excuses that couldn't cover up the deep void between them. But Maya shook her head, her eyes fierce. "No, Richard. It's always about your work. Your empire, your business, your legacy. You've forgotten about me, about us." She paused for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with each painful breath. "And now, your hospital treated me like I was just another woman walking through the doors. You've turned your empire into a cold, lifeless machine that doesn't care about the people it's supposed to protect. It doesn't care about me." Richard recoiled at her words. It was like a punch to the gut. He had been so consumed with building his business, climbing higher, reaching new heights, that he hadn't noticed the cracks forming in the foundation of his personal life. He had neglected the one person who had always been by his side. The one person who had made everything possible. His wife, the woman who had put up with his absence, his disregard, and his blind focus on his empire. "I never meant for this to happen, Maya," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've always provided for you. I've always given you the best of everything. What more do you want from me?" The question lingered in the air like a desperate plea. But Maya didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze to Sarah, who was standing in the background, watching this exchange with a mixture of guilt and fascination. It wasn't just the hospital that had failed Maya. It was the system, the way everything had been set up. The way people like her, people with money and power, were overlooked and taken for granted. She had realized that all too well in that moment. Sarah, still feeling the weight of her own mistakes, stepped forward, trying to break the tension in the room. "Mrs. Donnelly," she said softly, trying to regain some sense of professionalism, though her voice wavered. "I'm sorry for what happened earlier. I didn't realize who you were. I've been working here for so long, but I've become numb to the people who come through these doors. I should have treated you better. I'm sorry for the way I acted." Maya looked at Sarah, her expression still unreadable. She wasn't angry with the nurse anymore. She was more angry with herself for letting this happen, for allowing herself to be part of a system that had done this to her. It wasn't just Sarah's fault, it was the entire system. The neglect, the bureaucracy, the way people like Maya had been pushed aside. Richard looked between the two women, his mind racing. This was more than just an issue of bad treatment. This was about his hospital, the heart of everything he had built, failing the one person who needed it most. His empire, his creation, was built on this very institution, and yet, it had turned Aga. As the door to the delivery room closed, Richard stood frozen, his mind whirling. The sterile, white walls of the hospital seemed to close in on him, suffocating him with the realization of how far he had strayed from the life he once envisioned with Maya. She had always been his partner, his equal in every sense, but somewhere along the way, he had forgotten her. The woman who had stood by him, who had trusted him with her dreams and their future, was now in the most vulnerable moment of her life, and he had failed her. The sound of her cries from behind the closed door sliced through the silence like a blade. Richard stood there for what felt like an eternity, his eyes locked on the sterile walls of the hospital. It was as if the whole institution was mocking him, his creation, the thing he had poured every ounce of himself into, was failing not only his wife but also the very idea it was meant to uphold. He had created an empire, a legacy, but in the process, he had lost sight of the people it was supposed to serve. Richard's thoughts raced back to the moment he first started building this hospital. It was supposed to be a place of healing, a beacon of hope for everyone, no matter their background. He had envisioned it as a place where no one would ever be ignored, where the wealthy and the less fortunate would receive the same level of care and respect. But the reality was far different. Maya had been ignored, dismissed as just another patient, and the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin was now suffering alone, pushed aside in her moment of need. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to be there, holding her hand as they had planned so many times. But something held him back. He wasn't sure what it was, guilt, shame, fear, but he felt like an intruder in the space that should have been a sanctuary for them both. He had already made the mistake of failing her once, and now, as he stood outside the delivery room, he couldn't bring himself to walk through the door. It was too late for that. He wasn't sure if she would ever let him in again. Richard turned, his heart heavy, and walked back down the hall to the nurse's station. He needed to do something, anything, to make it right. As he approached the counter, Sarah looked up at him, her face still pale from the earlier confrontation. She had been silent for a long time, watching him as he stood at the edge of a precipice. She could see the turmoil in his eyes, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said everything. She knew, just as he did, that this moment would define him, that his actions, or lack thereof, would determine the future of not only his marriage but the future of the hospital. "Mr. Donnelly," Sarah finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "What are you going to do about this?" Richard looked at her, his brow furrowed. He wasn't sure what she was asking him. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "This hospital," Sarah said quietly, "it's not just your legacy. It's a place where lives are meant to be saved, where people should feel cared for, not neglected. I'm not the only one who's failed. You've built something that's become a machine, something that's lost its soul. People are being ignored. The system has become a place where the powerful get preferential treatment, and the rest are just statistics. This is about more than just your wife. It's about everyone who walks through those doors and never gets the care they deserve. Richard felt a sharp pang in his chest as Sarah's words hit him with the force of a wave. She was right. He had been so focused on his own success, on building the hospital into something bigger and more impressive, that he had failed to see what was right in front of him. The people, his patients, his employees, his wife, had become numbers, faces without names, statistics to be shuffled around in the machine he had created. He had lost sight of the very thing that made this hospital important, the people who walked through the doors seeking help. "I know," Richard said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been blind. I've been so focused on the wrong things that I didn't see what I was losing. But it's not too late, is it?" His eyes locked onto Sarah's, a glimmer of hope flickering in them. "I can fix this. I can change things." Sarah didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, as if weighing his sincerity. Then, with a slight nod, she said, "You can. But it's not just about making things right for your wife. You need to fix the system. People's lives are in your hands, Richard. You can't keep running things like this. You can't keep making decisions that benefit only the rich and powerful." Richard swallowed hard. It was like a weight had been placed on his shoulders, a burden that he wasn't sure he could carry. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of determination. He had been given a second chance, a chance to right the wrongs that had been done, not just to Maya, but to everyone who had ever walked through the doors of St. Gregory's Hospital. "I'll do whatever it takes," Richard said, his voice steady now. "I'll make it right. I promise." But as Sarah nodded and turned back to her duties, Richard's thoughts turned back to Maya. What would she say when she found out what he was planning? Could she ever forgive him for the years of neglect, for the way he had treated her like just another part of his empire? Would she ever trust him again? He wasn't sure, but he knew he had to try. He had to show her that he could change. But as he stood there, lost in thought, a loud cry echoed from the delivery room, pulling him from his reverie. It was Maya. The cry wasn't one of pain, it was a cry of relief, a cry that rang out like a bell through the corridors of the hospital. Richard's heart skipped a beat. She had done it. She had given birth. And as the sound of the baby's cry filled the room, Richard felt a mixture of fear and hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but in that moment, he realized that everything had just changed. He wasn't the same man who had walked into this hospital hours ago. The empire he had built was no longer his priority. His priority now was Maya, and the life they had created together. He had no idea how he would make things right, but he knew he had to start somewhere. With one last look at the nurse's station, Richard turned and walked toward the delivery room, his steps more purposeful than they had ever been. Richard approached the delivery room with a mixture of emotions swirling inside him. The crisp, antiseptic air of the hospital felt suffocating now, a reminder of all the mistakes he had made. But as he neared the door, a deep sense of urgency took over. He couldn't afford to waste any more time dwelling on his failures. Maya had just given birth, and that moment, her strength, her resilience, was a reminder of everything he had taken for granted. He pushed the door open, his heart racing. Maya was sitting on the bed, cradling their newborn in her arms. Her face was pale, but there was a quiet strength in her expression as she looked down at the tiny life she had brought into the world. The moment Richard entered, her eyes flickered up to meet his, and for a fleeting second, he saw the raw vulnerability in her gaze. She was still in pain, still recovering, but there was something else there too, a wariness, a guardedness that he hadn't seen before. He stepped into the room slowly, unsure of what to say, what to do. This was the most important moment of their lives, and he had no idea if it was even possible to make it right. How could he fix the years of neglect, the countless times he had put his empire before her and their family? How could he prove to her that he was still the man she once loved, the man who had stood beside her through everything? Maya, he said, his voice tentative, almost fragile. I'm sorry. I don't even know where to begin. He felt the weight of the words as they left his mouth, realizing how inadequate they sounded. Sorry. That word couldn't possibly make up for the years he had spent building a life that didn't include her, for the neglect that had turned into a deep chasm between them. Maya didn't respond at first. She just sat there, gazing at the baby in her arms, her fingers gently stroking the newborn's tiny hand. Richard couldn't tell if she was even listening to him, but the silence between them was louder than any words could ever be. She had been through so much on her own, without him. She had fought this battle alone, and now, as she held their child, it felt like the first real moment of connection in a long time. Finally, Maya's voice broke through the stillness. "You don't get it, do you?" she said softly, her words carrying a weight that made Richard flinch. "You never understood, Richard. You built an empire, a legacy, but you forgot the one thing that matters, the people. I wasn't just your wife, I was your partner. And when I needed you, when I needed someone to care, you weren't there. You were too busy with your meetings, your mergers, your name. And when I came here, expecting the one place that should have cared for me to show some humanity, I was ignored. I was treated like just another patient, like just another number." Richard's throat tightened as the full weight of her words hit him. She wasn't angry, not in the way he expected. She was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally, tired of carrying the burden of their relationship on her shoulders while he continued to chase his ambition, his success. And it wasn't just about the hospital or the empire, it was about the years he had neglected her, the moments he had missed. "I know," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. "I've been blind. I thought I was doing the right thing, building a future, providing for you, for our family. But I see now that I've been so focused on everything else that I didn't see what was right in front of me. I didn't see you, Maya. And I'm sorry." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Maya didn't respond. The room was filled with the soft, rhythmic sound of the baby's breathing, a reminder of the new life they had created. Richard could feel his heart beating in his chest, each thump echoing through the silence like a countdown. Was it too late? Could he fix the damage he had caused? Maya finally looked up at him, her eyes red from exhaustion and unshed tears. "I don't know if you can fix it, Richard," she said quietly, her voice steady, but there was a sadness in it that tore at his soul. "I don't know if you can fix what's broken. But I need to know that you're willing to try. That you're willing to be present. For me. For our family. Because I can't keep doing this on my own. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not." Richard nodded, his throat tight. He could feel the weight of her words sinking in, deeper than anything he had ever experienced. He had taken her for granted, thought that his success, his wealth, would be enough. But it wasn't. It would never be enough without her, without their family. And now, standing here, looking at her, holding their child, he realized that all the things he had been striving for meant nothing without love, without connection. "I'll do whatever it takes, Maya," he said, his voice firm now, filled with a new resolve. "I'll change. I'll be here. I won't make the same mistake again. I'll be the man you deserve." Maya's eyes softened for a brief moment, but there was still a wariness there. She was tired of fighting, tired of waiting for him to see her, to truly see what she needed. But there was also a flicker of hope, a glimmer of the woman she used to be, the woman who believed in their love, in their future together. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he could change, that he could make things right. But part of her was scared of being let down again, scared of putting her heart on the line when it had been broken so many times before. She looked down at the baby in her arms and then back at Richard. "You're right," she said quietly. "You have to change. But it's not just about you. It's about us. It's about making this family whole again." I need you to be here, Richard. I need you to be present, not just in body, but in heart. And I need you to fix the things you've broken. Richard felt a lump form in his throat, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was looking at the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. She was still the strong, beautiful woman who had stood by him, but now, there was a sense of finality in her voice. She wasn't asking for change. She was demanding it. And if he truly wanted to salvage what was left of their marriage, he had no choice but to rise to the occasion. I will, he promised. I will fix it. For you. For our family. I'll be the man you deserve. And I'll be here, for every moment, every step, from now on. Maya looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to gauge whether his words were sincere. Finally, she nodded, the tiniest hint of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. We'll see, Richard. We'll see. And as he stood there, looking at her and their newborn, Richard realized that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, full of difficult decisions and hard truths, but he was ready to face it. He had no other choice. The future of his family depended on it. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Donnelly felt truly awake, aware of the man he had become and the man he needed to be. The days that followed were filled with an overwhelming sense of purpose for Richard. Every moment, every decision felt different now. The once cold, clinical halls of St. Gregory's Hospital seemed to take on new meaning as he walked through them. It was no longer just about status or profits, it was about people, the very lives the hospital had been built to serve. He had to make things right, not just for Maya, but for everyone who had been affected by the cold, impersonal system he had allowed to thrive. It wasn't going to be easy, and he knew it. There would be resistance, there would be challenges, but Richard was determined. He couldn't go back to the man he had been. Richard started by taking a long, hard look at the hospital's operations. He walked through every department, every ward, listening to the staff, watching how they interacted with the patients. What he found shocked him. There were glaring disparities in the way patients were treated. Privileged patients received immediate attention, while others waited for hours, sometimes days, without care. The nurses were overworked, the systems outdated, and the sense of community he had once hoped to foster was non-existent. It was a machine, a well-oiled, impersonal machine that didn't care about the people it was supposed to help. It cared about one thing: profit. Richard spent countless hours in meetings, speaking with department heads, nurses, and doctors. He listened more than he spoke, learning about the challenges they faced. There was a culture of fear, of pushing through, of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. He had created a place that wasn't just inefficient, it was broken. And it wasn't just the systems, it was the people, the attitudes, the culture. He had turned a hospital, a place meant for healing, into a corporation, and in doing so, he had lost sight of everything that mattered. It was clear that change had to come from the top down. Richard knew that if he was truly going to make a difference, he needed to set the example. The next step was to talk to his board, the ones who had helped him build his empire. But he knew that their priorities would clash with his new vision. They cared about numbers, about expansion, about increasing their bottom line. He was no longer sure that was enough. For the first time, Richard questioned the very foundation on which he had built everything. As he prepared for the board meeting, Richard couldn't help but think back to the conversation he had with Maya in the delivery room. Her words were still fresh in his mind: "I need you to be here, Richard. I need you to be present." It wasn't just her words that lingered, though. It was the look in her eyes, the quiet determination in her voice. She had been asking him to be more than just a provider. She had been asking him to be a partner, a husband, a father. She had been asking him to put family, to put people, above all else. And in that moment, he realized that his marriage wasn't the only thing that needed saving, it was the entire hospital. It was the very thing that he had poured his heart and soul into, and yet, in doing so, he had lost sight of its true purpose. The board meeting was tense. Richard stood before the group of men and women who had helped him build his empire, his legacy, and he felt a sense of disconnect. They were all businesspeople, investors, financiers, people who spoke in numbers and percentages. They weren't there to discuss the human cost of their decisions, they were there to talk about profits. But as he stood there, listening to the chairman speak about quarterly earnings, Richard knew that something had to change. "I've seen the way this hospital runs," Richard began, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I've seen the disparity in care, the way people are treated differently based on their income or social status. We can't continue this way. We're not just a hospital, we're a community, and we need to start acting like one." The room fell silent. The chairman raised an eyebrow, and one of the other board members shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Richard continued, undeterred. "We need to put people first. We need to make sure that everyone who walks through these doors is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or what they can pay. This isn't just about money, it's about healing, about making a difference in people's lives. We're going to change the way we operate, from the top down." There was a long pause as the board members exchanged glances. Some were clearly uncomfortable with Richard's words, while others looked skeptical. But Richard didn't back down. He was done compromising, done pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. He had made mistakes, but he was ready to fix them. "We're going to overhaul the system," Richard said firmly. "We'll start by treating our staff better, by making sure they have the resources and support they need. We'll bring in more staff, we'll upgrade our technology, and we'll ensure that every patient, no matter their background, gets the care they deserve. I'm going to make this hospital a place where people want to work, a place where patients feel safe and valued. We'll put an end to the inequality that's been festering here for far too long." The chairman finally spoke, his voice cold and calculating. "And how do you propose we do all this, Richard? We're talking about a major overhaul. This isn't going to be cheap." Richard met his gaze without flinching. "We'll find the funds. We'll reallocate resources, cut unnecessary expenses, and focus on what really matters. We'll make a long-term investment in our people. We'll make this hospital a beacon of hope, not just for the privileged, but for everyone who walks through our doors." The room buzzed with murmurs, but Richard didn't let it faze him. He had made up his mind. The old system was broken, and it was time to build something new, something that truly honored the people it was meant to serve. Later that evening, Richard returned home, his heart heavy but hopeful. Maya was sitting in the living room, their newborn cradled in her arms. The sight of them both, so calm and peaceful, filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. He sat down beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I did it," Richard said quietly, his voice filled with the weight of his decision. "I told them we're changing things. We're putting people first. This hospital isn't just about numbers anymore. It's about lives." Maya looked up at him, her expression unreadable at first, but then a small, tentative smile appeared on her face. She didn't say anything, but in that moment, Richard knew that she saw him. She saw the man who had been lost and was now finding his way back. She saw the man who was willing to change, to rebuild not just their marriage, but the very foundation of their lives. And as Richard sat beside her, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, he knew that this was just the beginning. The journey ahead would be long, filled with hard decisions and difficult conversations, but he was ready. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had purpose, real purpose. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.